Yeah, thank you, Sean. He stole one of my lines. So yes, this is the first time I've given a talk since I gave a talk on Active Directory for NT5, and we'll skip the other 20 more years than I care to think. I had slightly different colored hair back then. So then I started looking up the slide title, and it's like, DR, are you ready? And it sounds like an introduction to a game show. You know, are you ready for DR? And my hypothesis is that you are probably not, and we'll forget about the 40 years of experience. So DR, why are we doing this? And we'll see if the slide build works. So what's the purpose of restoring AD? Is it, come on. It makes you feel good. Yep. You like high stress environments, or to facilitate business resumption? Because if you're not going to facilitate business resumption, there's absolutely no point in restoring Active Directory. So, the moment you all dread, right? And if the audio was working, we'd get the phone call. So, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you get the phone call. It's the call. It's like, I can't log on, or I can't access my application. And it always happens at 3 a.m. in the morning. And the only reason it always happens at 3 a.m. in the morning is because somewhere it is now 3 a.m. in the morning. And if you've got a global environment, there's somebody trying to use it Active Directory almost 24 hours a day. So what do you do when you get the phone call? It's like, I've got to change the timing on these slides. Do you go back to sleep? That's the obvious first choice. Or do you start developing your DR plan? Or do you dive into your bug out bag, which of course you have next to your bed, and pull out your DR plan? Which of course says, don't panic. I mean, what else are you going to do? I find this really reassuring, by the way, because the first thing you're going to do is panic. So where is your DR plan? Assuming it's not in your bug out bag, and that you don't have a little towel that says don't panic. If it's not printed on paper, you are, to put it quite mildly, really, really screwed. Because everything else is now defined to be unavailable. And you'd be surprised how many people think that they can log on to their network, which of course is not available, and print out their network-connected printer, which is connected to a server that is no longer available, from the file system that is no longer available, their DR plan. So, and part of the point of this talk is to get you to think about what you actually have to do before you can recover your Active Directory. Because there's a lot of things, you know, you can come up with your own et ceteras on this. And I apologize for walking because it keeps me occupied. When is your Active Directory going to be fixed? The CEO wants to know, the board of directors want to know, your customers want to know, the rest of the world, because it's going to be on the front page of the New York Times, the London Times, the Singapore Times, that you are down. Quicker than you actually probably got the phone call, because they're awake and you're not. So the first thing is, do you actually have a communications plan to handle how you're going to communicate the fact that you are recovering your business, for which you are an integral part if you're running Active Directory, and to keep the CEO from calling you every 5 minutes and saying, "Is it done yet?" So the first steps. Why is it actually unavailable? Is it because the person that called you at 3 o'clock in the morning is looking at something incorrectly, or do you really have a problem? So do you have a corrupt directory? Do you have a corrupt domain controller? The operating system's actually corrupt? Like, can anybody say ransomware and all your domain controllers are unavailable? And why did it become unavailable? Of course, at this point, you're struggling out of bed and your office is like half an hour, depends on the 3 o'clock in the morning, it's probably not too bad to actually get there, assuming that you are not living in Houston and the roads are under 3 feet of water. So the why, you have to identify whether it was a rogue script that one of your admins ran and basically shuffled everything in the directory, whether it was an accidental or deliberate admin action, or whether you were under a ransomware attack. And that one's probably the easiest one to determine, because it makes a difference to how you're actually going to end up by recovering your directory. And if you don't have, I'll keep coming back to this, but if you don't have decision trees and a plan as to how you're going to handle each of these actions, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you have no clue what you're doing, and it will take longer to actually bring yourself back together. So what do you need to know? What are your critical DCs? That's the most important question to come up with. Do you actually know what your critical DCs are? They're for infrastructure support, critical business applications, and do you know which DCs in which of your data centers are actually... Oh! The sound does work. So who's available to rebuild the server OSs if they're down? Because unless you've got a TARDIS, it's not you. That was the last sound bite. So where are your critical DCs? Which are the important ones? We covered that. And which ones from the above list must be restored to meet the prime objective, which is get the business running again. Because it's not to make you feel happy that you've got this nice replicating Active Directory, because while that feels good, unless the business is actually bringing in money or sending out goods, the directory is sort of somewhat superfluous. I'm going to get through this presentation faster than I thought at this rate. So what do we need to do and consider for restoration of service? The basic decisions are, if the domain controller's OS is okay, then rebuild the directory. And if it's not, then you've got to start from scratch and reload everything. So how do you know the OS is actually really in a safe state for you to actually just reload the Active Directory onto it? Where are all the tools? What checks do you run? Who is actually going to do that? They're all things that you have to consider in your DR plan, which of course just says don't panic, before you even start moving forward. Assuming that you know the answer to the first two, then the next question is, are the backups of your Active Directory actually available, or did they get were they held on a system that itself has gotten corrupted, and in which case, where are your offline backups? You did take offline backups of your Active Directory backups, you didn't? So, you did? Yes. So the prerequisites are the network, the operating system, and the backup of the forest. You can't do anything. It's like if you can't route to your domain controller, and don't make the assumption that if your domain controllers aren't available, that it's not because somebody didn't corrupt the network switches. Because if they're doing a thorough job, then they will. Similarly, if they're doing a really thorough job, then you've got sort of NotPetya type environment and all your file systems are corrupt. And of course, we've already talked about the backup of the forest. So how do you verify the network? If the tools that the network team use to actually verify the state of the network are stored on Active Directory, then they've got a problem. If the current configuration is stored on an AD jointed? Yeah, okay, joined server, then again, you've still got a problem. So just restoring the Active Directory starts to involve lots of other teams that have to have their own disaster recovery plan that makes the assumption that AD is not necessarily available. And I've seen too many cases where the current configuration, the sort of printout of like what all the subnets are, it's like all the subnets are in Active Directory. I don't need to maintain a documentation. It's like, it's all up to date in there, right? Wrong. How, if the whatever system you're using, Semperis has one, there are plenty of other systems that enable you to rebuild an Active Directory from an offline backup, but if the offline backup files aren't available, you're not going very far. And then comes the question, once you've decided that you actually need to back up or restore from a backup, it's like, how far back are you going to go to restore your backup? If you're sort of have a set of files out there that just the default Microsoft system state backup, those files have all got copies of the operating system in, which means you've backed up the very thing that caused the Active Directory to crash. So you might actually want to consider going back a lot further than you would have done if you only had the Active Directory backed up. Again, unless you actually know what decisions to make at this point, it's going to take you a lot longer developing this on the fly to consider, what am I actually going to really do? So having made the decision that you're going to rebuild the operating system on all the domain controllers, where are they? You know, they're in a data center somewhere, possibly. They may be under somebody's desk in some remote office. Do you know what their IP addresses are? You can't use DNS because, by the way, that went down at the same time that Active Directory went down, so you can't just do a nice IP config. You've got this printout listing all the current IP addresses and their location and what data center they're in. And if they're in a big data center, then you know which physical rack the actual machine is hosted on, or put in if it's a physical one. And if it's a virtual one, then you better know which virtual host is actually hosting the domain controller. Which then comes down to the question, how do you rebuild the domain controller? If you've got gold builds for your domain controllers, then where are those images? If they're on an Active Directory integrated and domain joined machine, they're not available anymore. So where did you keep the CDs? And when you made your build, because you generate a build every month with the latest patches on it. Did you actually burn a CD of that build, or did you just let it go to a file system? Because if you don't have the build on a CD or a DVD these days, it's going to take you a lot longer to download an image of the ISO from the Microsoft website and then patch it. Because the last thing you want to do is rebuild your machines with an unpatched environment, since that's probably why you got burned in the first place. And of course, you've got servers in Singapore, Perth, London, Limerick, Houston, somewhere in California, the bit that hasn't fallen into the ocean yet. And you've got images of the build in all of those locations, right? Yeah, of course you do. So if your domain controllers are virtual machines, we now come to the really pressing question is, did the virtual host get burned at the same time that the domain controllers got burned? In which case, you're going to have to rebuild your entire virtual machine environment first. Now, to rebuild any of these, you've got to get to your data center, which is, of course, protected by the latest in advanced security that requires a badge access to get in, and the badge is protected by a certificate for which the certificate revocation list is hosted in your Active Directory. Oops. And assuming that it isn't, they thoughtfully provided a list of users who are authorized to open the door, and it's held as an Active Directory group. Not going to work. And then you realize that while you're sitting in Dallas, the data center is in Phoenix, Arizona. And you're just going to get out of bed and walk down to the data center and talk your way through the door, and then start recovering your domain controllers. Meanwhile, there's another data center somewhere else. So the people who are local, assuming you've actually got people local, are going to need to have instructions on how to actually start rebuilding the machines, given that you have scenario 3 in your disaster plan. Of course, the problem with that is that the instructions say print off the disaster recovery plan subsection 3. No, they need to have an actual physical binder. Anybody scared yet? Anybody actually doing this?
My primary domain controller is my phone.
You may be better off than a lot of other companies. So having gotten all of your base servers rebuilt with the operating system, which is going to take several hours, maybe days. Now, all the time this is going on, you've got the CEO on the phone saying, "Is it ready yet? Have you finished yet?" Because you are losing $300 million of revenue a day. And you're saying, well, the network's not ready. It's not my fault. And then the network team thoughtfully open every single port, because the fastest way for them to get the network back up and running is to actually remove all the firewall rules, because they don't actually know what the firewall rules should have been in the first place. So assuming that and that, by the way, is not a good answer from the network team, because when you start rebuilding your directory, the last thing you want is 20,000 workstations all saying, "Can I log on, please?" And you very definitely don't want your 10,000 applications, some of which are not critical, from also trying to hammer the system to try and find out what they're missing. So that then comes down to who's actually authorized to start the restore. Because the last thing you want is somebody deciding that because it's 3 o'clock in the morning, that the easiest way to fix this is to actually hit restore the Active Directory, and it wasn't really broken in the first place, but now it's going to be out of service and you're resetting the directory to the state it was 2 days ago. So somewhere you need a decision process that says the CSO or the CEO needs to basically, in the CYA mechanism, needs to sign a piece of paper that says, go for it. Now you've got your 200 domain controllers worldwide, some of which are in inaccessible places. My background is oil, and we had domain controllers on drilling ships in the middle of nowhere. That's the middle of nowhere, Texas, which is sort of like about 200 miles that way. And there is no way that you are going to get those domain controllers back up and running in a reasonable time. So what is a reasonable time? That's part of your decision tree. It's like any domain controllers, they're not up as OSs, ready to be restored in 4 hours, 6 hours, 24 hours, depends on your business and what the criticality is, and how fed up you are with the CEO saying, is it ready yet? Those domain controllers that are not going to be restored, you need to make sure that they are not going to get in the way once you start restoring, because if the operating system on those machines is okay and they still actually have a sort of bit of the domain controller on them, or there was a domain controller that was powered off in some obscure location because it was being serviced, somebody was doing something to it, and it comes back online, that could just as well cause you a problem. Unless you've got a backup product that actually takes care of that. Plug. So servers that are not part of the restore, you need to take care of. That's, of course, part of your disaster recovery plan, which we've already decided that you are reworking on the fly at this point. So I'm going to go through this way faster than... So, assuming that you have actually at this point now pushed the button on restoring your forest, you're going to get to a point where the forest is restored. Yay. Really good, right? And you think, that is going to be the end of all my troubles. No, wrong. How do you know it's going to work? I mean, how can you actually verify that the Active Directory you have restored is actually fit for its purpose, which is running the business? How do you re-enable the apps to get to it? Because you've already blocked every single application server from being able to get to it. How do you actually notify the apps that they can now start connecting to your restored forest to figure out what they need to do to get back into service? And if they don't have a disaster recovery plan that says, what do I do when I connect to an Active Directory that is 2 days old, and by the way, yesterday I changed my service account passwords, and I've got data in there that is looking at changes to the directory, so that my local copy of the database or whatever I've got in my application has information that is not in the Active Directory anymore. So how do they reconcile that, and what do they do? It's not necessarily your problem, but it's something that you will inevitably get pulled into, because from their point of view, the Active Directory doesn't match their view of reality. If you don't have a list of what the principal the most critical applications are. And I've talked to companies where they haven't a clue. And in fact, they've done things like go to their shareholder report and look and see which business unit is actually providing the most income to the bottom line of the company, and decided that anything to do with that, any domain controllers that are servicing apps that relate to that one must be critical. You'd be surprised how many companies really have no way of sharing information about criticality and no way of prioritizing stuff for disaster recovery. Then you've got the topic that your HR system knows about all the new employees and new contractor changes that were applied in the last 2 days, and assuming that it wasn't hosted on Active Directory and didn't get hosed, then you have to be able to control them putting stuff back into the directory. And that you need to do to make sure that it's not going to overload inter-site replication, because there'll be a lot of other network traffic going on with all these business applications trying to restore themselves at this point. And which are the most critical applications to allow on and in what order? And everybody's going to have their own view as to what the most critical application is, which is why you need a disaster recovery plan that clearly lays it out so that somebody has signed off on it that says, you know, when they come back and say, I want my app to have access to this, you can clearly point to something that says, the networking team has been instructed that not to allow you in until this other application is up and running because they're making $30 million a day and you're making $2 million. And because of Mr. Sean here, he said, wherever he is, he said, you've got too many slides. So that was the sort of 30-minute version of the presentation. There are a lot more things, and the more you think about what you need to do to restore and why you're doing it, the better prepared you're going to be. And the timing on things like how long it takes to rebuild your servers and to restore the directory are things that you can practice with modern recovery tools. Then you can practice that in test environments, and you start to get an idea of the fact that my directory is 20 gig in size. It's going to take me on a underperforming virtual machine, it's going to take 4 hours or 6 hours to actually restore the directory and have a mini tree. So then you basically double that and you put in your SLAs that I'm going to tell my management that it's going to take 12 hours to recover the forest once we hit the button to restart it. But it's going to take 36 hours to get the infrastructure in place to actually, before I can push the button. And at that point, they can prioritize that 36 hours needs to come down to 6 hours, or some value that matches with the cost. You know, what's the cost benefit versus what they need to spend on fixing it versus what they're going to lose per day in revenue and lost opportunity costs and the loss of trust. There's a better word for it than loss of trust, but it's, depending on the business you're in, it can be quite critical. And all of that is made in the assumption that it's only one Active Directory that you lost. So most companies have multiple Active Directories, which means that for each directory you need a disaster recovery plan. And you need a disaster recovery plan that covers how you're going to actually deal with each disaster recovery plan for each individual directory. Some of them might be handling manufacturing plants, some of them might be handling sales, some of them may be just there for the hell of it, or they may be legacy systems that really don't matter. Questions? Anybody not scared at this point? Anybody actually has a fully operational DR plan that they've tried and tested? I mean, not for real, I wouldn't want that, but if you haven't actually had a sort of annual DR test, then you probably haven't thought through all of the things that you need to get done before you can actually recover your business. Go on.
How do you weight prevention versus cure? This is always my thing. Do we just prevent it from being corrupt versus curing it once?
As you're never going to guarantee to prevent it from being corrupt. Because if the attacker is determined enough, they're going to find a way in. So you have to make the assumption that it's not if, it's when. Now you hope that when is far enough in advance that you've retired, right? But that is not a disaster recovery plan. If you start thinking like that, then you're making the assumption that the Active Directory gets attacked, the company is going to go out of business, so there's no point in actually recovering the Active Directory.
And just to add to this, I think Chris made the point earlier, but for those of us that have been in AD for a while, the risks and the things that you had to prevent against have changed, right? So you used to think about natural disasters or schema corruption or stuff like that, and now we're seeing much more of the kind of ransomware style attacks. So it's kind of changed the playing field a little bit.
And to give you a real world example, a company that I was working with, they were a partner of ours in another life, not with Semperis. They supported and ran SAP systems in South America. And when the Maersk got caught by the NotPetya, it was, I think, on a Thursday afternoon or a Thursday evening. And the first they knew about it was when they got calls and they could not issue payroll to the local employees. So it had major implications for their local staff. Never mind that, it's like these are people that are having to pay rent and go out and buy food. The weekly paid the dock workers in ports up and down the coast in Peru, as it happens. And so they had to make arrangements to basically work with the banks to actually pay them a guessed amount. They had to sort of guess how much it was within the right ballpark that they were actually issued cash. Because they couldn't make electronic payments, they didn't get the feed from, has all sorts of implications. What was the other one? It's like...
Oh, I just said I love ransomware.
Oh, yes.
Because it impacts people who used to not have to care about
Yes.
it.
It was much nicer in the 90s when all you had to worry about was script kiddies, because they made so much noise that they got stopped in sort of minutes. Now there are systems out there, and it's like the ransomware stuff, some of it has been infecting your systems for months, ready to be triggered. Which is why I was saying that it's no point in necessarily restoring your operating system from a backup, because all you're redoing is restoring the untriggered system, and unless you like restoring your Active Directory on a daily or weekly basis, then you'll get good at it, but it's not going to fix things. So you really have to think in terms of going back to a fundamental base OS and then reinstalling and restoring the non-OS components like of Active Directory and any other applications on top of that. And the attack that got, I think, Saudi Aramco, they were lucky because it didn't hit their servers, it only hit their workstations. But some of these attacks actually corrupt the disk BIOS. So part of your plans on there, it's like before you even restore the OS on the domain controller, you may actually have to replace the server hardware on which it's running. And that can take days. Because you may end up by having to unrack and re-rack equipment. Or you have to have a contract with a disaster recovery center where you can rebuild your environment. And that means all your IP addresses might change. So anything that's got hard-coded IP addresses, does your backup system of your Active Directory, will it recover onto alternate IP addresses? That's a question you need to ask. Because if it doesn't, you're sort of semi-screwed up. Any?
Two real quick questions. One, do you have any tips on leveraging planned power outages as planning for DR? And then the second question is, there's a firewall company that's pretty popular whose name rhymes with Palo Alto. And they use security groups for access through firewalls. So if your domain controllers vanish, your firewalls can flat out block everything. Ask me how I know this. Your firewalls just say nobody's talking to anybody today. Go.
Yes, but that also means you have to have built into that the fact that the people who do need to access those machines can get through. I mean, it's not. It's not just the fact that it needs to block things, but how do you know that the firewall wasn't itself attacked? And therefore, what it's actually doing, you know, you may have a firewall with thousands of lines of rules in it. How do you know that one of them wasn't changed? So what you think is good behavior is bad behavior, because there's this big hole in it which other people are coming through. And so unless you've got the tools that says I can verify and validate what's on my firewalls and what's being routed or not routed, because if somebody's really going to set out and given the current sort of political situation on a global scale, if somebody decides to really screw with your company, and it could be because they don't like you, they don't like what you do, you're from the wrong country, you've got stuff in the wrong place from their point of view, then they can make your life very difficult and their life really easy. Right. And part of the goal in some of these is to actually get in and put you out of business. There are some people that are trying to put you out of business, and there are some people that want you to pay them money so that you don't go out of business. They're, you know, in some ways, they're the easier ones, because if they put you out of business, they can't come back and screw you again. But we've got other groups that literally want to put you out of business permanently.
If the kidnapper kills all of your children, there's not really any more reason to pay ransom.
Exactly.
That's a conversation. Yeah. What about on the planned power outage stuff? That was one of the things we've used. Any takeaways on that?
Yeah, I got a story on that one.
Okay.
So and this happened by sort of accident. So you have a data center with dual power supplies to every single machine, A leg and the B leg, and they run a test on the A leg They basically switched the A leg off because, of course, the B leg is going to keep everything going, right? Except they basically wired both the A and the B leg into the same switch. And if you've ever seen a large data center go down in one go, it's not a pretty sight. They didn't make that mistake twice. They made it 3 times.
Can I ask a question?
No.
For the audience, because this is a very, very experienced audience. Can I just get a show of hands for who has recovery time objectives, explicit recovery time objectives for their Active Directory versus, oh God, we hope it just doesn't happen. So.
But having heard what I've said, are your recovery time objectives actually achievable?
Well, we're starting with who even has them, and what I've seen is not very many hands go up, so which is a sobering assessment.
Because I'll say with like the Semperis product, we could probably get your Active Directory back up and running in maybe 4 hours or 6 hours, a bit longer if you've got a really, really huge directory. But in some ways, that's not the issue. It's how long is it going to take before you can actually start that 6-hour clock down.
In the larger context.
Yeah, and it's like I said, I used to work for a Fortune, 50, 100, very large company. We had 200 plus domain controllers scattered across the globe. And to give you an example, at one point, one of them was being dragged on a ship from South Korea to off the African coast, right? So, and it was in satellite link, download. It was online all the time. Great, but without disaster recovery, and there were 2 domain controllers on board, so if one went down, it could be rebuilt from the other. If they both went down, forget it. Yeah. But that meant all the equipment that was on board was also out of action. And the middle of the Indian Ocean is out of helicopter range for somebody to fly stuff in. A drilling ship in the Gulf of Mexico, you can get a helicopter to it. But you're talking about scheduling a helicopter, the cost of a helicopter, getting stuff out there. It takes a long time. It's not necessarily, and that would be a critical machine to rebuild.
One last question. Long time ago, I think Gary Olson at HP and some other people were talking about lag replication sites. And Microsoft, of course, I don't believe supports lifeboats, lag replication sites anymore. Plus, you need to have one per domain.
Exactly.
Or actually a pair per domain.
They strongly discouraged it at the time, although that's precisely what saved Maersk.
But that wasn't deliberate.
No,
that was accidental.
That was exactly my takeaway. It was like, okay, so go read the article, and that's essentially what saved their buttocks.
Yeah, my impression is it's a technique that works, and if you understand the mechanics underneath it and what can go wrong, there's no reason why you wouldn't do it. And just to be clear, a lag site is essentially an Active Directory site with one or more domain controllers in it set up on a schedule such that it replicates only occasionally. So it acts as kind of a warm backup. The idea being that if your Active Directory otherwise gets hosed, you have this site that hasn't replicated in a while that perhaps is not hosed. Now, in the case of Maersk, they had a domain controller that was powered off in some African country, I forget where now. And that was the only source of an Active Directory backup they had, was that one disk drive and that one server that happened to be in an office that was powered off. And they were able to recover their AD, over the course of many days from that one disk. But
I've done something similar 20 years ago where we had one domain controller from each of our domains running as virtual machines back when Microsoft didn't support virtual machines, and basically they were up all the time, but we would shut them down on a regular basis daily,
Okay.
take a backup of the underlying of the VM structure, and we'd also change the replication epoch on the machines when we took them down, so that we could use them for other purposes. It's also the way we gave our auditing guys the ability to have a system they could crack passwords looking for
Were you
common
worried about
passwords.
How long ago was that? Were you worried about USN rollback? Because we set up a pair of lag sites like that. Only we had a lag site. We called them port and starboard for
Yeah.
lifeboats, and you had one,
Yep.
and it replicated off of the other. So if you hit that, Lady Luck screws you yet again, you get corruption into the lag site
But-
just as the
but
disaster.
Yeah.
The
it's
issue,
the
the,
problem
so
with
so
that.
the issue
Yeah,
with
so we had two.
right, but the issue with
We
that,
have 6 days.
the issue with that is when you got 200 plus domain controllers worldwide,
Right.
right? Yeah, you can build your forest on two machines, and then you've got to build then you've got to build like 8 machines off that, and then build 8 machines off that over possibly slow network links. Even these days with high-speed links and on a large directory, it's still going to take a long time to get those systems back versus having a sort of backup
I'm
system
not-
where you can bring
I'm
large
not,
numbers
I'm
back
not
up.
advocating it as a solution.
Right.
I'm just, we were looking at it as a source of truth.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when somebody sits there and goes, well, who was in that security group? I asked quietly to myself. Oh, well, it was Peggy, Sue, Sunil, Juan, and Danny. And you're right.
Yeah.
You could crack the password